Hey, we're back today with another video from Matt Walsh. If you recall, he released a video before that attracted a lot of attention regarding anxiety and mental health. And let's just say he's obviously kind of crazy and borderline believes that mental illnesses do not exist and that people are using it for attention, blah blah blah. And just recently, he released another video that talks about Dissociated Identity Disorder, or DID. Needless to say, there's a gold mine of content here, so let's see what kind of nonsense he's talking about this time.
Several months ago, we discussed one of the hottest new trends among young people, especially on TikTok. It's the coolest new thing, multiple personality disorder, or as they call it now, dissociative identity disorder. And just on TikTok alone, there are thousands of DID influencers raking in millions of views as they talk about their alleged experiences with this condition. And they even demonstrate what it looks like when they switch from one personality to another.
That's the thing about TikTok, right? It literally has a bit of everything, so I'm not surprised that there are influencers who make DID a big part of their content. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't use TikTok very much. Sometimes I browse it, sometimes I just see a clip from it. Perhaps some of these TikTokers are pretending to have multiple personalities just to follow the trend and gain views. And if that's the case, then yeah, I don't agree with taking advantage of a real mental illness that real people have in order to gain attention on social media. But this becomes more of a moral issue rather than a scientific one, and I'm really only interested in the latter for today's video.
You know, they put that on camera too, because that's how the illness works, they claim. Mental illness is now a party trick. Like, hey, look, everyone, I just switched into a new personality. Coincidentally, this new one is just as insufferable as all my other ones. Like, I don't have any good ones. But yeah, it's a whole new one.
Matt is not only being insensitive here, he's also just plain wrong. Regardless of what these TikTokers are doing, mental illness is something that should be taken seriously because it affects real people. And if you don't have a mental illness yourself, it's incredibly difficult to put yourself in the shoes of other people who do. Which is why when interacting with people who have such mental states, your experiences will almost never apply to them. For example, if you think you can solely just stay positive, exercise, or change your mental state to escape depression, well, it certainly is not that easy. It's easy to imagine that sort of thing when you have a normal brain. The same applies to other mental illnesses too, such as anxiety or DID. So back to the point, sure, there are probably some idiots on the internet, but that applies to really any issue. Don't look at these TikTokers and think they're the norm, because you, Matt, believing that these disorders not even being real is a whole issue by itself.
So this weekend, there were multiple headlines floating around about a guy named Leonard Stockel, who claims to have 10 unique personalities, all with their own names and ages.
I don't understand. What is so shocking about that? An average person with DID will usually have around 10, maybe more personalities, and that's pretty average. Sometimes they are diagnosed with less initially and more are discovered along the course of treatment. There are even cases where people reached up to 100 different personalities. That makes sense, right? If your brain is behaving in such a way, what scientific reason states that it has to stop at 2 or 3? You've probably seen from movies and whatnot where people could have 2 personalities, but remember those are just movies and don't often apply to real life. Matt here has probably watched too many movies and hasn't read enough actual science. Anyway, the next part Matt just talks about Leonard for a bit, so we're going to skip that since I don't want to make this about a specific person.
Now, the first thing we should establish about dissociative identity disorder is that it's like totally fake, okay? It's almost certainly completely fake.
Ah yes, Matt finally revealing his true thoughts. Please explain to me why I should listen to some random person on the internet instead of the researchers and psychologists that actually work in this field. Of course, like many other mental illnesses, it can be hard to classify what is or isn't DID. Hell, our diagnosis system isn't even perfect, partly because of how different DID can be depending on the culture of the individual. That being said, just because we have certain difficulties with classification does not mean this mental illness does not exist. It occurs in about 1% of the global population, and it affects real people.
In fact, there was a survey conducted of board-certified U.S. psychiatrists back in 1999, and out of 300, only 21% thought that DID was scientifically valid, and the rest thought that there was not enough evidence to support it.
Oh, that's it? You're just going to make that claim without providing a source? How wonderful. Is that just generally how you operate, or am I missing a joke somewhere?
An article in Psychology Today argues that DID is a bogus diagnosis and cites the fact that the famous cases which popularized this condition, the cases which are the only reason why any of us have heard about it, have turned out to be hoaxes. There's a paper by Joel Paris published on the National Library of Medicine website calling DID a medical fad, and then there's an article in the Harvard Gazette which points to research showing that the central basis for this diagnosis doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
It's so annoying finding these sources when he only mentions the author and website. Somehow, after a while of research, I was able to find the article Matt is referencing. Okay, so he's talking about a paper titled The Rise and Fall of Dissociative Identity Disorder. Let's read the abstract. Dissociative Identity Disorder, DID, once considered rare, was frequently diagnosed during the 1980s and 1990s, after which interest declined. This is the trajectory of a medical fad. DID was based on poorly conceived theories and used potentially damaging treatment methods. The problem continues, given that the DSM-5 includes DID and accords dissociative disorders a separate chapter in its manual. Okay, so let's just stop here. Instantly, you can tell this paper is a fraud, and there are multiple ways to know. First of all, the abstract is poorly written with biased wording, and it doesn't say anything about the study itself. Abstracts are very important because it gives the first impressions to any published paper. You start with an introduction, introduce your methods, your conclusions, and of course your interpretations. This abstract here fulfills very little and really only includes about half of what a normal abstract contains. That's how I know, at least, this paper is somewhat unprofessional, but that doesn't automatically disqualify it. The other way I know is that there are a lot of articles written that are in direct response to this paper. Many other scientists came together and actually debunked the claims here, and just a simple Google search gives you many results, such as this one here titled Growing Not Dwindling, debunking the original paper, claiming it doesn't look at international studies, references outdated papers that has since been debunked, and doesn't keep up with current research. And I totally agree, the science of DID is quite well established already, and claiming otherwise is simply ignorance. Wow, my job is easy when someone else has already done it for me. Of course, unlike Matt here, I'll be leaving some links in the description, so feel free to check out those studies for yourself.
The article starts by pointing out that multiple personality disorder was coined in the early 20th century by a neurologist who was working with a woman who he thought might appear to have two personalities. And this was the first that anyone had coined this term or talked about it. And of course, now we're talking about people like, I have 20 personalities. In the beginning, it was one person who maybe there's two. And for most of the rest of that century, the diagnosis was extremely rare, and most people in the world had never heard about it. But then the book Sybil was published in 1973, followed by 2 film adaptations telling the allegedly true story of a woman with multiple personalities.
Thank you for giving us an account on how this disorder was first diagnosed. Nobody cares how this began, or if the first patient diagnosed was faking it. This medical condition has been studied and observed for a long time now, and it sits on the back of mountains of science and publications. I don't care if the first story is real, fake, 2 personalities, 100 personalities, because that doesn't matter anymore. What we know about DID does not ride on the backbone of the first account or a movie that was created. It rides on research.
The psychiatrists who advocate for it say that people who suffer from DID, they generate these other personalities as a way to wall off memories of traumatic childhood experiences. So they create a sort of amnesia barrier, they call it, protecting the patient from trauma.
Yes, the overwhelming majority of patients diagnosed with DID also had an account of trauma, usually early on in their lives. That's why a detailed account of past trauma is important in a DID diagnosis. This kind of reminds me of the TV show Severance, where the main character chooses to separate his work memories in order to spend some time where he doesn't have to remember his dead wife. DID is kind of like that, but instead of it being voluntary, it's involuntary, so you have phases of changed personalities as a result of trauma, and it usually comes with gaps of memory. If you want more information on how it is caused and the general outline of how this is diagnosed and symptoms, one of the links I'm putting down below will be the DSM-5 manual, which is a standard manual guideline used by doctors and psychologists in diagnoses of mental illnesses.
The issue here is that, first of all, it's just ridiculous. Like, it's a ridiculous cinematic theory and sort of a way of looking at the human person. That you have trauma, and so your mind, like, is all this subconscious, does all these things and creates all these personalities to get around the trauma. It just doesn't even make any sense.
Really? It doesn't make any sense? You, being someone who has not experienced intense trauma as a kid, is claiming that this doesn't make any sense, huh? Trauma is a real thing. PTSD is a real thing. Our brains deal with trauma in different ways, and for extreme cases, it can indeed cause a permanent mental change. Some people end up with DID, some people don't. Our brains are weird and we can't explain all of it. But you, being someone who has no understanding of science whatsoever, is trying to say DID cannot come about from trauma because it doesn't make any sense in your tiny brain. Amazing. We've hit the pinnacle of stupidity. Like I said before, if you don't have a mental disorder yourself, it's incredibly difficult to put yourself in the shoes of someone who does. So don't even try to apply your own logic or thinking process. It's not the same. People with mental illnesses are already dealing with enough in their lives, and the last thing they need is to hear some idiot on the internet claiming their mental condition is fake. Anyway, that's the end of the video today. Thank you to the usual patrons, Fireshard, Alan Morton, Miss Fixit, and Edward Martin. I'll see you in the next one.